vanishing folklore and belief.
The Dominion of Neptune, from Stories of Old Greece and Rome, by Emilie Baker, public domain reading, circa 1913. Neptune and the Sea Gods. In the days when the Titans ruled the universe, Oceanus with his wife Thetis controlled all the lakes, rivers, and seas. But when the Titans were overthrown, Neptune took possession of this great kingdom, and old Oceanus reluctantly gave up his dominion over the waters of the earth. Though anxious to assert his supreme authority, Neptune allowed some of the descendants of the Titans to keep their small kingdoms, on condition that they own allegiance to him as their ruler. Among these was Nereus, son of Oceanus, who was celebrated for his vast knowledge, his gift of prophecy, and his love of truth and justice. He and his wife Doris, also a child of Oceanus, had 50 daughters called Nereids, and they were so beautiful that Neptune chose one of them, named Amphitrite, for his wife. There were 2 others of the Nereids who became famous: Galatea, beloved by the Cyclops Polyphemus, and Thetis, the mother of Achilles. But none of them equaled Amphitrite in her beauty. When Neptune first went wooing the Nereid, she was frightened by his formidable appearance, for he drove in a chariot drawn by huge sea horses with brazen hooves and golden manes, and the god himself carried his terrible trident, or 3-pronged spear, with which he shatters rocks and commands the storms, and shakes the shores of the earth. None knew better than Amphitrite the extent of Neptune's power, for she had often watched him, when a storm was at its height, raise his all-compelling trident, and immediately the waves would cease raging, and there would be great calm. Sometimes she saw a ship, doomed by the sea god to disaster, gliding confidently in quiet waters, when all at once a fierce storm would break over its head, and the hapless sailors, as they breasted the angry waves, would pray vainly to Neptune for the help that would never come. Many a good ship had nearly gained her port when he spake, and round about him called the clouds, and roused the ocean, wielding in his hand the trident, summoned all the hurricanes of all the winds, and covered earth and sky at once with mists, while from above the night fell suddenly. The Odyssey, Book 5, line 348, Bryan's translation. When Amphitrite saw this imposing-looking god driving toward her, she was frightened by so much splendor, though she could not help but admiring Neptune himself, with his sea-green beard and his long flowing hair crowned with shells and seaweed. Since the enamored god could never come near enough to plead his suit, he sent one of his dolphins to do the wooing, and this was so successful that the fair Nereid was persuaded to become Neptune's wife and share his golden throne in the heart of the sea. To reward the dolphin for its skill in having won for him the much-desired bride, Neptune placed it in the sky, where it forms a well-known constellation. Though Neptune had undisputed control over all the waters of the earth, and over all that moves through the paths of the sea, he once aspired to greater power and even plotted to dethrone Jupiter. But the ruler of gods and men discovered his wicked plans, and to punish him, deprived him of his kingdom for some years, during which time he was obliged to submit to the humiliation of serving Laomedon, the king of Troy. It was while he was in service here that he sought Apollo's help in building the wall of Troy, whose stones fell into place under the spell of the sun god's music. Laomedon had promised Neptune a large reward if the wall was built within a certain time, but when it was finished, he refused to pay the sum agreed upon. Though angered at this treachery, Neptune had to endure the king's injustice until his years of service were over. But as soon as he was restored to his former power, he created a terrible sea monster which spread terror and death over all the land of Laomedon. Not knowing how to meet this calamity, the Trojans consulted an oracle and were advised to sacrifice to the monster a beautiful maiden each year, and so to prevent the wrath of Neptune from overwhelming the whole country in disaster. Reluctantly, the sorrowing people prepared to obey the oracle, and a victim was chosen by lot and led by the priest to a large rock on the seashore, where she was securely chained. Then the hideous sea beast glided out of its cave in the slimy rocks and devoured her. Each year this terrible ceremony was repeated, and at last the lot fell upon Hesione, the king's only daughter. Laomedon tried in vain to save her, but the lot was cast, and nothing could avert the appointed sacrifice. In despair, the wretched father saw the fatal hour approaching, and when the day drew when Hesione was to be led down to the sea, he forgot his avarice and proclaimed throughout the land that a great reward would be given to anyone who could slay the monster. Hercules appeared just in time to save the doomed maiden and killed the monster with his oaken club as it was dragging Hesione into its cave. The king was overjoyed at his daughter's rescue and told Hercules that he might claim the reward. But even when he saw the hero come with the beast's head as a proof that he had slain it, he once again refused to part with his much-loved gold. So Hercules returned home, but he did not forget Laomedon's perfidy, and when later on he came again to Troy, he killed the king and took his children captive to Greece. Neptune, like all the immortals, loved more than once, and among those who shared his affections was a maiden named Theophane, who had so many suitors that it kept the jealous sea god in constant fear, lest she should prefer some earthly lover. So he took her to the island of Crumisa, and there changed her into a sheep, while he carried on his wooing in the form of a ram. The offspring of this marriage was the famous golden fleeced ram, whose pelt was the object of that ill-fated expedition made by Jason and his fellow Argonauts. Neptune also loved the goddess Ceres, and followed her during the long time that she spent in search of her daughter Persephone. Ceres was angered by the sea god's persistent wooing, and hoping to escape from him, she took the form of a mare. But Neptune was not so easily discouraged, for he changed himself into a horse, and contentedly trotted after her. The child of this strange pair was Arion, a wonderful winged steed that had the power of speech, and was of such incredible swiftness that nothing could ever equal it in speed. The most famous children of Neptune and Amphitrite were Triton and Proteus. Triton was his father's trumpeter and at Neptune's command he blew upon his conch shell to calm the restless sea. His body was half man and half fish, and he gave the name of the Tritons to all his male descendants, who, with the Nereids and the Oceanides, the daughters of Oceanus, followed the chariot of Neptune when he went abroad to view his kingdom. Proteus had the charge of the great flock of sea calves, which fed on the soft seaweed and basked in the warm sands near his cave. He was celebrated for his wisdom and for the truth of the answers that he gave to those fortunate enough to make him speak. Homer calls him the Ancient of the Deep, whose words are ever true. But his knowledge was not easy to obtain, for he had the extraordinary power of assuming any shape that he pleased, and only those mortals gained his advice who persistently clung to him through his many bewildering transformations. When the climbing sun has reached the middle heaven, the Ancient of the Deep, who ne'er deceives, emerges from the waves, and covered with the dark scum of the sea, walks forth and in a cavern vault lies down. The sea calves from the hoary ocean throng, rank with the bitter odor of the brine, and slumber near him. Then ye must exert your utmost strength to hold him there, although he strive and struggle to escape your hands, for he will try all stratagems and take the form of every reptile of the earth, and turn to water and to raging flame. But hold him fast until the aged seer is wearied out in spite of all his wiles, and then question him. Bryant Homer's Odyssey, Book 4, line 518. Aristaeus was the son of Apollo and the water nymph Cyrene. Beside tending his flocks and herds, he took care of the olive trees and vineyards and was a famous beekeeper. He was very proud of his beehives, and the swarm of bees increased each year under the guidance of his skillful hands. But one day he found hundreds of the bees lying lifeless beside the beehive, and on the morrow there were still more among the dead. Not knowing how to account for this disaster, Aristaeus hurried to his mother to ask her help in saving the few bees that remained. Cyrene lived under a mountain stream, and hearing that her son wished to speak to her, she commanded the river to divide and form a wall on either side, so that Aristaeus might walk in dry places. When the youth told her of the tragedy befalling the beehives, she could not help him, but bade him to go to old Proteus, for he alone could tell him what the trouble was and find a remedy. She warned Aristaeus of the difficulty in holding the Ancient of the Deep when he tried to bewilder and terrify the stranger by rapidly assuming different forms, and she bade him remember that he must keep the sea god fast bound if he would receive the wished-for answers. And then she led him to the cave of Proteus and hid him there, exhorting him to be bold and fearless. At noon the Wizard of the Deep came up out of the sea, followed by his herd of sea calves, and while they lay stretched out on the warm sands, the god saw the retreat of his cave, and soon was in a deep slumber. When Aristaeus saw Proteus fast asleep, he stepped cautiously up to him and bound him with strong fetters. The god woke with a start and tried to shake himself free of the chains, but on finding that he was a prisoner, he resorted to all the trickery that he could command. He became a fire, a flood, a wild beast, a horrible serpent, and many other forms calculated to terrify the beholder. But Aristaeus was not afraid, and soon the old wizard realized that he must submit, so he assumed his own shape and asked the youth what it was he wished to know. The son of Cyrene told him the death of his bees and begged for some remedy. Then Proteus reminded him of how he had been the real cause of Eurydice's death by making her flee from him in such haste that she did not see the snake at her feet. The wood nymphs who were Eurydice's companions had therefore wished to punish Aristaeus and had sent this destruction of his beehives. It was necessary to appease the wrath of the wood nymphs. And to do this, Proteus bade the youth build 4 altars and sacrifice on them 4 bulls and 4 cows of perfect form and size. This burnt offering was to placate the nymphs, and when it was made, he must pay the funeral honors to Orpheus and Eurydice to pacify their anger against him. At the end of 9 days, he was to return to the grove where he had made the sacrifices. Aristaeus thanked the Ancient of the Deep for his wise words, and after releasing him from the fetters, hurried away to do as Proteus had advised. The sacrifices were made, and suitable honors were paid to the dead, and then, after waiting impatiently for 9 days, Aristaeus went back to the grove. To his great joy, he found that a swarm of bees had taken possession of the carcasses, and that he was now the owner of a much larger number than he had ever had before.